Mark Twain once said, "Be yourself" is not the kind of advice you'd want to give to most people. And yet, throughout the history of ethics, many people have said that this is pretty much the way to happiness, is to just be yourself. And this idea of self-actualization can be boiled down to simply being yourself, or becoming who you are. There is a big trouble with Twain's assertion, and that is, if you don't tell people to be themselves, who else can they be when you get right down to it? You don't really have a choice. You can't be somebody else. And so, like it or not, we have to be ourselves. And then the question is, well, how much of the good life is just being yourself? Self-actualization. Can we give complete account of the happy or good life in terms of self-actualization? And a number of philosophers have said yes. And I want to look at two people today, Nietzsche and Montaigne. Before I do that, though, we really need to make a couple of distinctions, and I want to raise a few questions, too, just to sort of situate everything. The first distinction is between, if you will, objective versus subjective accounts of self-actualization. Objective self-actualization presupposes this. The self is real and can move from potentiality to actuality. And potentiality versus actuality is just something's potential. It could be, but it isn't, right? And if it's actual, it actually is. It's become. And hence self-actualization. And the model for understanding this process is really natural growth. We start out with a certain seed, which contains potentialities within it, and the process of growth and living is a process of slowly unfolding and making actual what's merely virtual or potential at the beginning. The view that I call subjective self-actualization is this. Self is nothing but a potentiality, and, if you will, indeterminate potentiality, if you will, a kind of raw material out of which it creates itself, or it creates a self, let's put it that way. Now that's a very different view, and the reason why I call it subjective is that there's no determinate self there at the beginning of the process. There's no objective standard by which the process of self-creation can be guided. And so the model that you find for this notion of subjective self-creation is not natural growth, because natural growth is a process of unfolding objective potentialities, but rather what it is modeled on poetry or art. Because in art, if you have a lump of clay, there's no particular statue or pot waiting there that needs to be brought out. That piece of clay, that silly putty or whatever, can be made into just about anything. And so there's no objective constraint on the person who's modeling it to model it into one thing or another. Now, some artists, like sculptors like Michelangelo, argue that there really is slumbering in every piece of marble the statue that's supposed to be in there. That's a bit hyperbolic. I mean, he never turned down a commission because he couldn't find the piece of rock in which the commissioned statue was slumbering. He never did that. And the reason is that marble is pretty much an indeterminate kind of medium, and you can make virtually anything out of it. The same piece of marble that he carved the David out of could have been carved into a clown or something grotesquely sentimental. It could have been carved into a giant Mickey Mouse, but he carved it into David, and we're all very grateful for him. This is a very important distinction, and philosophers who fall along the objective side of the equation would include Aristotle and Montaigne, Schopenhauer, and you could also put Jung. Jung has a kind of self-actualization ethic built into his psychotherapeutic practice. Now, the people who fall on the poetic, subjective side would be spectacularly Nietzsche, and more recently, Michel Foucault. These are the two great advocates of self-creation. This distinction will mean something as we start moving through these texts. A question I want to raise, in addition to just getting this distinction out on the board, is this. What is the connection between self-actualization and evil? And the first connection you can raise is this. What do you do with a bad seed? This is why Mark Twain says, be yourself isn't the kind of advice you'd want to give to most people, because he was a very pessimistic guy. He had a low opinion of human nature, and the idea of people being themselves is rather horrifying to him. Would you say to Jeffrey Dahmer, Jeffrey, you just got to be yourself. You can't be anybody else. Or Hannibal Lecter, or any other spectacularly evil person. Would you say, well, you can't really blame them. I mean, they were cursed with a bad seed, a bad nature, and they were just doing the best they could do with the crappy material that nature had given them. Is self-actualization a matter of actualizing your potentialities for evil, or sloth, or vice? That's an important question. We have potentialities to do lots of bad things too. Is an ethic of self-actualization therefore an invitation to be as bad as you can be? And to find the particular kinds of badness that are right for you? Now, this also brings up another issue, and this is the issue of regret, or repentance, if you will. Is it a proper goal to aim for a life in which you have no regrets? And can you aim for a state of not regretting anything without completely pulling down any kind of moral standards? Because the main reason for people regretting things is that they think they've done something wrong or failed to live up to something. A life without regrets might have to be a life without any standards. And is that really worth the end? Is that too high a price to pay, giving up on standards in order to give up on regrets? The issue is this. I guess there are different kinds of regrets. The main kind of regret that I guess I'm talking about would be sort of moral regrets. Guilt. Let's put it that way. Is a life without guilt a worthy goal to have? Is complete self-acceptance and not feeling bad about yourself a worthy goal to have? And can that goal be achieved without completely eliminating any standards by which you could judge yourself to be bad? And if it requires the elimination of standards, is that too high a price to pay in order to be able to accept and like yourself all the time? These are issues that Nietzsche forces us to confront, and also Montaigne in this reading forces us to confront those kinds of questions. In answer to the issue about self-actualization and evil, Aristotle is very clear about self-actualization. He recognizes that human beings have all kinds of potentialities that they can actualize, including the potentiality to be less than human. The lowest category on his moral scale is what he calls the bestial. And he thinks that some people can, through their actions, or through abuse, or neglect, or a horrible upbringing, never really become fully human or lose their humanity and become like wild beasts. They're no longer moral agents. They can't be held responsible for their behavior. What he would call bestial, we would call the criminally insane. People who simply cannot be held responsible for their actions. Or if they're not constitutionally flawed, they have ruined themselves in some spectacular way. Ted Bundy is an example I gave earlier of somebody who, in trying to exculpate himself for his evils, laid out how he gradually habituated himself into becoming a monster, taking baby step by baby step until he was a monster and probably completely out of control of himself. Aristotle would say he's responsible for that process. He probably wasn't any more flawed than any other human being in terms of his potentialities, but that he simply educated himself and habituated himself step by step into being somebody who is no longer really a human being in the sense of having a moral agency or responsibility. And so it's not necessarily that the seed is bad, but it can be terribly tended too. There are two problems then. Some people might come into the world just constitutionally corrupted, and others can have normal ranges of potentialities, but just end up actualizing the worst of them. Aristotle believes that, again, we can have the potentiality to be less than human. So when he talks about self-actualization, he always says that happiness, or the good life, is the actualization of the soul in accordance with virtue. It has to be governed by some standard of morality. So we have to, first of all, know what the difference between virtue and vice is, between good and bad, and then we have to use that standard to differentiate between the potentialities that we ought to actualize and the ones that we ought not to actualize. Once we know the difference between good and bad habits, we can cultivate good habits and try and root out or extirpate or avoid bad habits. So for Aristotle, the ultimate standard for ethics is going to be the good, or excellence. He considers that to be an objective standard. And that the process of self-actualization has to be guided and governed by the good. So he would not say, be yourself. He would say, be the best self you can be, which is a much more specific kind of recommendation. Be the best you can be. Now Nietzsche is very different. Nietzsche really does think that evil is okay in some ways. He thinks that the distinctions between good and evil seem to be relativized to particular civilizations and eras, that it's possible to recommend that certain strong natures actualize not only their potentialities for good, but also for evil. After all, these things, these standards, are not permanent or fixed. They're relative and changing from time to time. And it might require in certain stages of life that we act in a way that's required, that's called evil at one time in order to bring about new goods or new standards of goods. In fact, what's evil in one age could be just redefined as good in another. Now, there's another position on this, and that's the position of Montaigne. And Aristotle says evil's not okay at all. Nietzsche says it's fine. If it's in you, let it all out. If you have a particularly strong and exuberant nature, why should you allow yourself to be hemmed in by long-standing superstitions about virtue and vice? Montaigne is different. Montaigne is very much like Aristotle in that he thinks that we have to look to standards of virtue and vice and judge ourselves by those standards. So he recognizes that the self is not the ultimate standard, right? You can hold selves up to a higher standard and say this is a good or a bad self. Nietzsche doesn't allow that. He doesn't say, allow us to hold up the self to a higher standard, but simply says each self is its own standard. Montaigne really recognizes that there are standards of good and bad that you have to look to judge yourself, but he also argues that, look, what's done is done. If you have done bad things in your life or contracted certain vices, and these things have become deeply ingrained to the point that they're second nature, there's no way that regretting them or repenting them is ever going to undo them. And since it won't change anything, since feeling bad won't change anything about the past, it only changes how you feel in the present, namely makes you unhappy, makes you morbid and self-persecuting. You should simply accept yourself. You might regret your crimes or your evils or your bad habits. He wasn't a very bad man. About the worst thing he ever did was sleep around a lot. Contracted syphilis from a whore. So did Nietzsche, for that matter. So that's another thing these two thinkers have in common. Nietzsche's one sexual encounter caused the contraction of syphilis, which later drove him insane. The last 12 years of his life he spent in a state of debility, insanity, basically. Complete mental collapse. Montaigne, was a bit self-indulgent with prostitutes. He could never say no to sex. Brigitte Bardot once said, when it's good, it's really good, and when it's bad, it's still pretty good. And that's basically Montaigne's attitude about sex. And so he had some regrets about this. He thought that it made him not as good a person as he really could have been. Yet at the same time, he realized that moping about it, persecuting oneself about it, is not going to change anything about your flaws. It just changes your state of mind today from a state of happiness to a state of unhappiness. So he says, look, I live without tears for the past or fears for the future. He simply wants to somehow accept himself and not spend his time repenting. What about the future? Well, in the future, he thinks that you should always strive to be as good as you can be. So there's a kind of moral earnestness and idealism about him, but at the same time, there's no use crying over spilled milk. That's his kind of attitude. So he's sort of between Aristotle and Nietzsche. Aristotle really doesn't have this attitude about looking at one's past without regret. He says the only person who should have no regrets is the person who's done nothing wrong, which means that we all should be regretful. He says a sense of shame isn't a good thing. Why? Because good men do nothing to be ashamed of. Well, that's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to give examples of things that people who've never done anything to be ashamed of. So anyway, let's talk first about this little selection. I'd like to start with Nietzsche. Okay, I guess I'll do that simply because he was the first person in the packet. There's a little book that Hackett put out called The Good Life. And I was thinking, great, I'll use this in classes on happiness and so forth. But as it turns out, the guy chose all the right thinkers, but chose almost entirely the wrong selections from them. And so the thing is totally useless to me. And I was thinking about the Nietzsche selection, and I thought, well, I'll use this, I'll copy this. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized this isn't the best selection either. But what can one do? This is why so many of the things in your packets of readings are not from this book, although many of the authors are represented in it. I regret giving you this particular selection in some ways, but still, we can make something out of it. He was really a great writer of cultural criticism, and the things that I like most about Nietzsche are his contributions to the philosophy of culture and history. I think they're extremely profound. And he had an extremely, I think, penetrating insight into the nature of spiritual disease, although less of insight into the nature of spiritual health. Let's talk about these texts. One of the most important and poetic pieces in here is on page 229, it's section 125, called The Madman. And this announces the death of God, which is Nietzsche's most famous thesis. I'll just read. Haven't you heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning, ran to the marketplace, and shouted unceasingly, I seek God, I seek God. Since many of those who did not believe in God happened to be standing around there, he was the cause of great laughter. Did he get lost then? Said one. Has he lost his way like a child? Said another. Or is he hiding? Is he scared of us? Did he go for a boat ride? Did he emigrate? They all shouted and laughed together. The madman sprang into their midst and transfixed them with his gaze. Where has God gone? He cried. I'll tell you where. We've killed him, you and I. We are his murderers. But how have we done this? How could we have drunk up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to erase the whole horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? And now where are we going? Where are we moving? Away from all suns? Aren't we falling constantly, backwards, sideways, forward, in every direction? Is there still an above and a below? Aren't we wandering as if through an endless nothing? Isn't empty space breathing upon us? Hasn't it gotten colder? Isn't night and more night continuously coming upon us? And so on and so forth. Now, what's he saying here? Well, he's saying God is dead. Now, what does that mean, first of all? Well, it doesn't mean that once upon a time there was a God, and then God grew old and died. Gods don't do things like that. Certainly not the God that he's referring to, which is the Christian God, who's not supposed to die at all. Nietzsche didn't believe there was any God to begin with. So he didn't believe that he literally died. So what is he saying? What he's saying is that the idea of God is dead. And specifically, what does he mean by that? He means to say that the civilization of Europe, which is at its core a Christian civilization, doesn't believe in its own core anymore, namely Christianity. People go to church still, and they say their prayers and stuff like that, but they don't really believe it. They don't even know what it would mean to believe it anymore. The death of God, therefore, for Nietzsche, is not something that happens to God or in God. He doesn't have a heart attack and keel over like in some Monty Python cartoon. What happens is God dies in us. So the death of God is something that happens to human beings. And what does he think is happening? Well, he thinks that there's a kind of constriction and narrowing of the soul that goes on when God dies. a constriction and narrowing of the soul in this sense, that it becomes difficult or impossible for human beings to imagine anything bigger and better than themselves, anything that transcends them in importance. And what a god is for Nietzsche is a kind of symbol of transcendence, something that opens the soul up to what lies above itself. And what happens when God dies is the soul closes in upon itself and treats itself as the highest thing in the world. He thinks it's really a bad thing. It represents a kind of inward collapse and constriction of the soul, which is not good for it, because he does think that the soul requires for its health a kind of openness and longing for things that transcend it. And that a soul that thinks that it's the highest thing in the world, that worships itself, is ridiculous and pathetic. The most pathetic example of this in sort of pop culture, has anyone ever watched Absolutely Fabulous? This British comedy. Well, Idina Monsoon is an example of what Nietzsche calls the last man, which is a person who simply can't conceive of anything bigger, better, or more important than herself. And she's just one of the most pathetically selfish and self-absorbed people on the planet. She's totally absurd. Her father dies, and she doesn't deal with this. And when she finally breaks down crying, she breaks down crying saying, "I don't want to die." And then she retails all the money she's spent on her body. You know, she's been plucked and shaved and moisturized and all these other things. And she ends with the line, "This corpse ain't croaking or I'm suing." She's the total paradigm of the self-absorbed, shallow consumer. And really what Nietzsche's talking about when he talks about the world in which God is dead, or the world that he calls the last man, are just invincibly vulgar people who are entirely caught up with themselves and their creature comforts. They're the people who draw their sense of worth from the things that they own that other people covet. He really thought that whatever the ultimate nature of things is, whether they're gods or not, the soul has a nature of its own and needs of its own. And the healthy soul is a soul that looks outside itself and above itself to things that are ideal or holy. A person who holds nothing sacred is capable of doing and being anything. And usually that means doing and being small and bad things. Whereas heroism and greatness, the creation of culture, civilization, all the fine things of life, is created by people whose souls are open to things that transcend themselves. There are very few great artists who didn't have some kind of openness towards things that transcend themselves. I don't really think much of Picasso. He's a marvelous example of a person who is totally self-absorbed. I don't think much of his art, though. But if you look throughout most of history, you find that most of the great creators and political leaders and so forth have always been inspired by something higher. If you look at most of Western art, at the core of it is religion. Most of the great genres of Western art started out as having to do with church music, church decoration, and things like that. And it was only after a very long time that it became secularized. So there's something to this. Human greatness seems to require the willingness to subordinate the self to certain ideals. And God, for him, is the symbol of all these ideals. And therefore God is, or whatever God one has, is the core of a culture. And this is why he talks about who gave us the sponge to erase the whole horizon. The horizon, for him, is a kind of metaphor for the set of values that make a culture intelligible. The horizon is the boundary of the world. And what makes a world, a culture, a distinct human world, are a set of values. He talks about tables of judgments and values, or that the foundation of culture. And God is the linchpin of all of these things, and when God is erased, the boundaries of things are erased. Things become infinite in all directions. Moderation, order, is replaced by infinite tasks that have no end. And this is a wonderful description of the kind of society we live in. There's no sense of the proper order or moderation of things anymore. People simply have tasks they perform, but many people don't have a sense of when enough is enough. For the ancients, that was a sign of slavishness, to simply be a tool and not be a person who controls one's art, but simply a functionary in some larger machine that directs one's activities, is to be a slave. Yet the kind of education most people have today is to just make them highly efficient tools and functionaries in some grand scheme that they themselves do not control, and really nobody controls. It simply has a life of its own now. Whereas the idea of a gentleman or a lady is a person who has not only certain skills, but also a sense of enough is enough. And that sense of enough is enough is connected in some way to a set of values, a hierarchy of values. And for Nietzsche, the linchpin of this is the sacred, in whatever form it takes. So he goes on again. What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? The sun is the thing that the earth orbits around, and that's a nice metaphor for God at the center of the culture, right? A civilization orbits around its core set of values. And when those core values disappear, it no longer has a regular motion, a regular path. It simply floats off into empty, infinite space. Now, Nietzsche thinks this is a terrible thing, because it represents a terrible diminution of man. However, he also is a great enemy of Christianity, and he really thinks that Christianity brought its own demise upon itself, that its value system was internally inconsistent, and therefore it had to collapse. But he thinks that its collapse is a bad thing because he thinks that human beings, for the most part, are made decent and noble and good by participating in a civilization or culture and subordinating themselves to that discipline, to the discipline of institutions and culture and so forth. And that's true of all civilizations, Christian or Greco-Roman or whatever. Nietzsche was a greater admirer of the pagans than the Christians, but he recognizes the value of civilization as such, and since Christian civilization, or Christendom, that's an ancient word that's never used, really is at the core of modern global civilization, which he saw coming. He really did predict the westernization of the entire world. He really thought that this was a terrible disaster, because at the very time that Western civilization was gobbling up and beginning its process of colonizing and transforming the whole globe, it had lost its own core and convictions and courage. The 20th century is a long record of, on the one hand, enormous progress in science and technology, and enormous failure and cowardice and retreat in the area of culture and ideals. And confidence, which is interesting. So he looked upon this as a disaster. And what his hope was, though, was that some new civilization would come about. And what a new civilization would require is a new God, a new table of values, a new Moses coming down from the mountain and legislating, and a new openness to the sacred. Now, how does that come about? Well, there have to be Moses types, right? There have to be people who chisel those tables of laws and say, God told me that this is what we're supposed to do, these 10 commandments. But that became the core of the civilization that we exist in today and has globalized itself to the furthest extent of the surface of this earth. Yet at the same time, no one really believes that anymore or knows what it would be to believe that in the sense of living by it. So, on the one hand, he thinks that the death of God is a disaster for most human beings, but on the other hand, he does think of it as a real possibility for some. And those some will be the new creators, the new legislators, the prophets of some sort of new form of civilization. And these people he calls free spirits. And he really does seem to reserve the idea of self-creation for these people. It's very clear that Nietzsche regards the spiritual health of most people as having nothing to do with self-actualization. In fact, he's a great advocate of self-mortification, when you get right down to it. Nietzsche, in one of his most beautiful books, which he wrote the last year of his life, or last year of his working life, it's called Twilight of the Idols, and in there he talks about how every culture is like a pyramid. And the heights of culture are very small and narrow, and they rise upon the foundation of a broad, low base of solidly packed mediocrity. And his attitude is that the fate of most people is to be this solidly packed basis of mediocrity above which the people rise. And he thinks that that's good for them. That's as good as most people are going to get, to take part in civilization or culture and be subjected to its discipline, which means to be subjected to whatever it considers sacred, to its God and its values. Now, let's take a look at a passage here. This is on page 234 at the bottom where it says 356. This is section 356 from his book. It's called How Things Will Get More and More Artistic, in quotes, in Europe. The need to make a living still forces upon nearly all male Europeans a role. I guess he didn't realize that it's now forcing itself upon most female Europeans, too. Their so-called profession. Even today, in our time of transition, when so much is ceasing to force things upon us, some retain the freedom, and apparent freedom, to choose this role, their profession, themselves. Most have it chosen for them. The result is strange enough. Nearly all Europeans confuse themselves with their role when they reach a more advanced age. They themselves are the victims of their good acting. They themselves have forgotten to what extent chance, moods, and whims controlled them when their profession was decided. And how many other roles they perhaps could have played. For now it is too late. Viewed more deeply, the role has really become character, and art, nature. Art becomes nature. The role becomes character, art becomes nature. Now this sounds like a lament, right? People have this persona, this mask, the businessman, right? Or the society hostess, or whatever thing one ends up being. And by performing this role for a long enough time, they become it. They lose their freedom. By acting a certain way, they become a certain thing. And they don't recognize that they could be other things. They have other potentialities, and their freedom is restricted and constricted, and that sounds like a terrible thing. Well, for some people that really would be terrible. But Nietzsche doesn't think that this is a terrible tragedy for most people. In fact, the tragic thing for him is not that people have personas and become personas, but that they realize this at some part in their life and become discontented with the lot that they have to play. That's the real tragedy. And so he goes on to laud the Middle Ages. There have been ages in which one believed with solid confidence, in fact with piety, that one was predestined for precisely this business, precisely this way of earning one's bread, and simply did not want to recognize the element of chance, role, arbitrariness. Classes, guilds, and hereditary trade privileges brought about, with the help of this belief, those enormous social hierarchies that characterize the Middle Ages, and which one has to credit with one thing at least, durability. And duration is, on earth, a value of the highest rank. So what he's saying is that in more traditional societies, the mediocre people are more solidly packed together, and you have a more durable structure. Why? Because they have less self-awareness of the difference between their person and their persona, the mask that they wear. And so they're less discontented with themselves. So what he's really saying is that most people are more contented the less self-conscious they are, the less aware of what society has made them into, and how different that is from what they themselves could have made themselves into. This is interesting. He thinks that for most people, self-awareness is just a source of discontentment, and that the stupider you are, the happier you are. Ignorance really is bliss for the majority of human beings. And he thinks that the majority of human beings only attain a certain nobility and worth by being bricks in a larger edifice, namely the edifice of a civilization, and being subordinated to the discipline of its values and culture. And if you turn to page 236, you find this very clear. He says, "For that basic faith is dying out on which one can count in that way, the faith on the basis of which one can make promises, anticipate the future in a plan, sacrifice the future to one's plan, namely the faith that human beings have value, have meaning only insofar as they are stones in a great construction, for which purpose they must first of all be stable stones, and above all not actors, not people who realize that they're acting, but people who just act, who identify themselves with their role entirely and have no ironical or self-conscious distance from the role that they play in society. Briefly put, it will still be kept silent long enough." He's saying, I can say this public and no one's going to know it. You don't have to hide anything in this world because people pass right by it anyway. What from now on will no longer be constructed, no longer can be constructed, is a society in the old sense of the word. We are lacking everything to build this construction, above all the material. None of us is material for a society anymore. There's a truth that is timely. It makes no difference to me that meanwhile the most short-sighted, perhaps the most honest, and in any case the noisiest kind of human being that there is today, our friends the socialists, believe, hope for, dream, and above all scream and scribble roughly the opposite. For one can really read their watchword for the future, free society, on every table and wall. Free society? Yes, yes. But you know, gentlemen, don't you, that what such a thing is built of? Wooden iron. The famous wooden iron. And this wooden iron isn't even wooden. Now, wooden iron in German is just a kind of idiomatic phrase for something that can't exist. It's a self-contradiction. A free society, he's saying, is a self-contradiction. You can't have civilization if everybody is free. Why? Because civilization requires hierarchy, order, stability. It requires, again, the broad, solidly packed base of mediocrity above which the peaks of civilization can rise. If every one of those little stones decides it's got to be itself and be a free spirit, the whole structure collapses and flattens out, and we get modern consumer society, where everything is pretty much the same. And even all the things that were considered high and holy, well, you can order them from a catalog now. There's no sense of the unity of cultures anymore, or the unity of styles. We have this kind of postmodern eclecticism and playfulness. Nothing is serious anymore. Everything is playful. Put it this way. Everything can be ordered from a catalog. Cultures have been reduced to simply consumer goods that you can mix and match, right? You can go and get your hair done in dreadlocks if you want. And no one realizes that dreadlocks mean something, or used to mean something, and that some white guy in Atlanta shouldn't be wearing them. You know, in the original context, these things had certain meanings. They have no more meanings anymore. You can buy them if you want. Anybody can, just the right amount of money. You interested in Tibet? Well, you can buy some little Buddhas and some things from little shops and put them on your mantelpiece. And 3 weeks later, if you're interested in something else, you decide you're no longer a Buddhist. You know, you like Adina Monsoon is sort of an on-again, off-again Buddhist. She starts chanting at one point, and her friend says, "Are you still doing that?" And she says, almost religiously. Well, you can be born again, or become Jewish, or whatever, which means buying new knickknacks, trying to fit them together in a kind of interesting, eclectic style. And nothing really has any purchase on us deeply. A person who really believes in something can never mix and match a style, or cultures. A person who's really a participant of a certain culture. A real Turk doesn't have a Christmas tree. But the thing is that to really believe something is to participate in it and not to have a distance from it, to take it seriously. Whereas people who don't believe things always have a kind of ironic distance from it. They don't take it so seriously that say, being a Jew doesn't exclude celebrating Christmas. And so this is the direction that Nietzsche thinks everything is moving in, because everyone wants to be a free spirit, a rolling stone. And the difference between high and low, sacred and profane, serious and frivolous, all these distinctions have been erased. And this is very bad for us as human beings. And so his attitude is that we need to create a new civilization. Well, how do you do that? Well, he recommends self-actualization. Well, why? That seems to be recommending the very disease as its cure. Nietzsche's cure for modern nihilism is homeopathic, meaning that he wants to cure modern nihilism with more nihilism. Why? Well, his attitude, I'm going to write a book someday, which I'm sure real scholars will scoff at, but I want to write a book with the title something like How Nietzsche Destroyed Western Civilization and Why He Did It. Because Nietzsche's ethics of self-actualization really seems to be in some ways regarded by him as a kind of homeopathic treatment for modern nihilism. In his book, Twilight of the Idols, he has a little section called Whispered to Conservatives. Okay. Nietzsche was very much a cultural conservative, but at the same time, he recognized that nothing goes backwards, everything goes forward. And he says, so if something is rotten, you can't unrot it, you can't restore it. You simply have to push it over, destroy it as quickly as possible, and get on to something new. And I think in some ways Nietzsche's ethical teachings, especially the ones that have been popularized and received in our culture with such fervor, are precisely designed to be received in our culture to speed up its own process of destruction. And this is why he treats nihilism with more nihilism, encourages the wheel along. He says you can't walk backwards like crabs. You have to go deeper, deeper into decadence. Why? Because once you go deep enough, everything dissolves. And we lose our sophistication. We become barbarians again, and barbarians believe things. And from the ashes of one civilization rises a new barbarism. There's a new openness to sacredness and the transcendent, and there are new gods appear, and new values, new cultures, and so forth. That seems to be his great hope. But at the same time, he does seem to think that there are some people who need to hear this teaching of self-actualization. Not because it'll make things worse, because for them it'll make things better. And these are precisely the people he thinks are to be the ones who impose, in some way, new tables of values and judgments. And as it turns out, even the term self-actualization is really wrong, because that presupposes some kind of prior notion of the self that becomes actual, that's virtual and then becomes actual. And for Nietzsche, that's not the case. In itself, the self is nothing in particular. What happens is we create a self. We create a self out of a kind of indeterminate stuff. And this is why, for instance, in the very beginning of the reading, he talks about how, she says, only as creators, this has given me the greatest difficulty and goes on being my greatest difficulty, to recognize that unspeakably more depends on what things are called than on what they are. He's saying that names are more important than substance. Why? Well, because things, by being given a certain name, become something. At the end of that little section, at the top of page 228, these last three lines, only as creators can we destroy. But we also should not forget this. Creating new names and assessments and apparent truths is eventually enough to create new things. Nothing really great ever comes about if people live like that. People can live like that. But everything sort of degenerates into a kind of clever animal existence. And Nietzsche's hope is that this sort of ethic that he preaches will bring this about by, in a sense, dissolving, first of all, the rotted remnants of our present civilization, which has lost its God and that therefore is on its last legs. It's only a matter of time. So on the one hand, it will act as an agent of dissolution, but on the other hand, for those few who really are strong and free spirits, will act as a kind of encouragement for them to create new orders and new values and impose them upon everybody else. And Nietzsche is extremely frank about that. Order is imposed from above. Well, let's flip back a couple pages to 229. What does your conscience say? You shall become who you are. Now that's a very peculiar claim. For Nietzsche, it doesn't make any sense, because who you are is nobody before you become. So it's not like there's first a self that then is actualized, so there's no who before becoming. And this is the strange paradox with Nietzsche. He uses this language of self-actualization from the Greeks, but at the same time he takes out the objective core to it and gives it a purely poetic, purely 100% creative meaning. The self is created, not actualized. It's like a poem or a piece of sculpture, not like a plant or an animal that grows over time. He says, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. In this way, I will become one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, love of fate. Let that be my love from now on. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Let looking away be my only negation. And all in all, to sum it up, someday I want to be only a yes-sayer. Loving one's fate, in a sense, means trying to take everything that fate gives you as an opportunity, rather than as a debility. And that is the hallmark of the people who benefit from the death of God, rather than are destroyed by it. If you want to look at the top of 234, he talks about these kinds of strong natures. About 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down, he says, in fact, when we hear the news that the old God is dead, we philosophers and free spirits feel as we were struck by the rays of a new dawn. At this news, our heart overflows with thankfulness, wonder, presentiment, expectation. At last the horizon appears free to us again. The horizon's been wiped away, meaning that, we can go anywhere and do anything. It's a source of possibilities for some. At last our ships may set out again, set out towards every danger. Every daring act of the knower is allowed again. Our sea, our sea, lies open there again. Maybe there was never before such an open sea. He's treating this as, at least for some, the free spirits, an enormous gift, a gift of possibilities for new creations. But what's to be created? New values. And what are values? Well, they're gods, in a sense. Personified, they become gods, and what do? Well, they're the foundations for new civilizations, new cultures, new orders of things, in which the masses of people will have to be reincorporated as less free, less self-conscious, more stable stones, who attain their worth by submitting to the discipline of culture. Now, I tend to think that there's a lot of truth to this, and that human worth is precisely connected with, in some ways, submitting to an external discipline or order of culture. For Aristotle, even the people at the top are submitted to this order, in some sense. Whereas for Nietzsche, the people at the top aren't really subject to anything. There's no prior order that they look to. They simply create out of their own inner resources. Okay, so they're not governed by anything outside themselves. Now let's look at this passage, 232, at the center of that page. Let us confine ourselves then to purifying our opinions and valuations, and to creating our own new tables of goods. But we no longer want to brood over the moral value of our actions. Yes, my friends, as regarding all the moral blather of some people about others, it's time to feel sick. Sitting in moral judgment should be contrary to our taste. Now the we here is the we free spirits. We few. And believe me, very few people ever read Nietzsche in his lifetime. So it always has an air of confidence, Let's leave this blather and this bad taste to those who have nothing else to do except drag the past a bit farther through time. This is what people are doing, just dragging the heavy, dead shell of their civilization forward a few more weak steps. Let's leave off on that. We don't need to drag this heavy weight behind us anymore. It's dead weight. In other words, the many, the majority, let's leave it to them. We, however, want to become who we are. Use that strange use of that phrase. And who are we? Well, we aren't anything to begin with. The new, the unique, the incomparable, those who give themselves the law, those who create themselves.